Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Pechet. Lag BaOmer Sameach to everybody and Shavua Tov. This week's learning is sponsored by Marcy Farrell in loving memory of her mother Joan Berman, Yonina Bat Shalom, on her Shloshim. We honor her memory with our collective learning. Okay, we're going to get started. We're back to straight halacha, no more drashot right now. Drashot of a different sort, I would say. No, not stories, but drashot on psukim. And what we're going to start with today, if you recall, we ended yesterday's daf with this drasha, which is going to stand as the basis of where we're starting today. I'll go back for a few lines. Kin nafshecha. Okay, this is the pasuk. Ki tavo b'kerem re'echa. When you go into your friend's vineyard, which we explained already means if you're working in someone else's vineyard. And then we tell you, va'achalta anavim kin nafshecha sovecha. You're allowed to eat grapes. The way I would translate it in English, to your heart's content, kinafshecha sovecha. Okay, but that's not how we're going to darshan this. Ve'el lo titain. But you can't, right? You can eat by hand, but you can't start putting and gathering a ton in a vessel and eating it, for the purposes of eating. So now we said, why does it say kinafshecha? Okay, so we explained what does that mean. Well, kinafshecha kinefesh shel bal habayit. We treat you like the worker as the owner. What does that mean? Well, just like manafshecha ochel upatul, if the owner was eating in the field, the owner would not have to take maaser. They wouldn't have to tithe the produce yet. You can go eat in your garden without taking maaser. If you're just eating there, you can eat. You don't have to tithe the produce. But likewise, nafshecha shel, when you're eating on the job, the worker also doesn't need to take maaser. So now the big question becomes, so when are you obligated in maaser? And that's going to be our question for the first part of the daf today. Amar Rabbi Yannai, ein tevel mitchayev b'maaser ad shir'eh pnei habayit. When you chayev b'maaser, when you bring the fruits into your house, when it sees the entranceway of your house, then they become obligated in maaser. How do we know this? Shene'emar, and we're now going to quote there's going to be two opinions here. Each opinion is going to quote from a different verse, but both in the same section. In Devarim chapter 26, it discusses what's called vidui ma'asrot, which you do 2 times in the 7-year cycle, where you say you basically have to get rid of any maaser you have in the house that you haven't yet given to the Levi, to the Kohen, etc. And then you make this declaration. And you say, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayit, I took out the sanctified items from my house. So what do you see here? That means you took it out of the house, which means it must have been you were obligated when you brought it into the house. Now he adds one thing here about pnei habayit, which makes it sound like it has to go in the front door of your house as opposed to some other way. We'll get to that a bit later. What does that come to exclude, and where is it derived from that it actually has to see the pnei habayit? Because this pasuk just seems like it has to be in the house. It doesn't really matter how it got into the house. Rabbi Yochanan amal afilu chatzer kovat. He says even your courtyard. Okay, in those days, people had a house and a courtyard. Right nowadays, you could sort of call it the backyard or front yard. But in those days, it was a little different, so that you would also have a joint courtyard. Right? We've talked about that in Eruvin. We had a lot of discussions about that. But either which way, we're talking about it doesn't need to go into your house. It just needs to enter your courtyard. How does he get this? Well, from the pasuk, before the pasuk we just quoted, we're in chapter 26 of Devarim. We're now on verse 12. Ki techale, I'll read the whole pasuk. Ki techale la'aser kol maser tvuotcha b'shana shlishit shnat ha'maaser v'natata la'levi lager layatom v'almana. Okay, so you have to give it to the Levi, the ger, the yatom and almana. Va'achlu b'sha'arecha v'saveu. And then you can eat in your sha'arim. Sha'arim means gates. Usually gates was a gate to your courtyard, not a gate to your house. And therefore he says, the fact that it says achlu b'sha'arecha v'saveu comes to say, even bringing it into the courtyard would actually already obligate you to tithe the produce. Because it says you can eat in your gates once you've given the maaser, which sounds like you can't eat in your gates if you haven't taken maaser yet. So we have a basic debate, and this is a debate that we're going to do a little ping-pong back and forth. What does each do with the other pasuk? And then we're going to move on and put them both in one category, really, and then bring 3 difficulties against both of them, which all seem to indicate that it doesn't actually have to go into your house or courtyard, not really mattering which one. It's actually at an earlier stage, or we'll see. But right now, we have this debate, house or courtyard. So the Gemara is going to start asking, Rabbi Yochanan, nami haktiv min habayit. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with the pasuk that talks about the house? Amar lecha, he says, or he would say, he's not here to say, but they put words in his mouth. Chatzer dumia debayit. Well, when we talk about a courtyard, we don't mean any courtyard. We mean the courtyard sets up the obligation for maaser. As soon as the fruits go into the courtyard, or the produce goes into the courtyard, you're obligated to take the maaser, as long as your courtyard is like a house. What makes a courtyard like a house? Ma bayit hamishtamel, av chatzer hamishtameret. It would have to be a courtyard that is a protected courtyard. Okay, there's a bunch of different ways a courtyard could be protected. Either it means there's a door and a lock on it, you have some sort of gate that locks, or it's a place where you're comfortable leaving items and you're not worried someone's going to steal them. There's some courtyards where people walk through. This could be a courtyard that people don't walk through, okay? There's all types of courtyards, so it has to be one that's somehow protected, okay? There's other criteria or something that could cause it to be, right? It could be any of these things would mean already it's a protected courtyard. But we're not talking about if it's a very open courtyard that anyone walks through and you would never leave anything precious there, valuable, because people will take it. So if we're talking about that kind of courtyard, then it wouldn't obligate you for maaser, even according to Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore that's what he learns from bayit. It defines what type of courtyard, one that is similar to your house. Now we're going to have to do the other side. Rabbi Yannai, nami haktib b'sha'arecha. How do you understand this gates, which sounds like the gates toward your courtyard? Now I mentioned before, it says, the woman, he said about the house, he said, ad shiret pnei habayit, has to see the entranceway of the house. So that's what he says, b'sha'arecha, your gates means you brought it through the main entrance of your house, as opposed to, it has to go through the gate, meaning through the entrance of the house. If you have some roof, and you bring the fruits through the roof, okay, through the upper level and then into the house that way, like let's say you have a ladder outside, you carried them up, brought them through your roof and into your house in that way, or some enclosed area that wasn't really part of your house and you brought it through there was maybe some side entrance, something like that, then you wouldn't be obligated to tithe the produce. Again, this would probably be on a Torah level, right? But on a Torah level, you're not obligated if you brought it into your house some strange way. It would have to go b'sha'arecha through the front door. That's what he derives from b'sha'arecha. Okay, so the first part today, it's a very simple structure. We have, although each part's going to be a little bit long, we have two opinions. What is considered gemar melakha, the finished product, that now we're going to be obligated to tithe. And we had two opinions, house or courtyard, and we did a little ping pong with the psukim. Now we're going to bring three tannaitic sources that seem to go against both of these opinions. And now we don't care which one. It seems to go against both. Rabbi Yannai and Rabbi Yochanan, even though they're baalei plugta, they argue. We're sticking them in one category, that they think it's bringing it into the house, into the courtyard. I'm going to bring three different sources which seem to indicate otherwise. The first is going to be the source we already saw, but we're going to derive something from it that we didn't discuss previously. And that derivation is going to be the problem. Mativ Rav Chanina Chozah. So he brings the difficulty from this drasha we had before, that we started with today. Kit nafshecha, that pasuk, like you, or you're like yourself. Kach nafsho shel poel, right? So again, like the owner, the worker is like the owner. In what sense is the worker like the owner? Ma nafshecha ochelu patur, af nafsho shel poel ochelu patur. So the worker is like the owner, that just like the owner is not obligated to tithe the produce, likewise the worker is not obligated to tithe the produce while they're out there in the field. But it seems to infer that there is someone who would be obligated in maaser at this stage. Who would that be? Not the worker, not the owner, but halokeh chayav. Because if the worker was compared to, right, if we're saying the worker's like the owner, and is not obligated to tithe, there must be someone who is obligated at this stage to tithe. Who would that be? A lokech. If I was the owner and I sold my fruits to someone, and there hasn't been gemar melakha yet, the assumption here, right, we're out in the field, the buyer would actually have to tithe the produce. And we're assuming my lav basadeh, are we not talking about when we're out in the field? Now we just said the fruits are not obligated yet until there's gemar melakha. Now if I sell my fruits to you in the field, there's no gemar melakha yet. You haven't brought it into a house. So why would it be obligated in tithes? So again, we're making an assumption that this pasuk is inferring that someone else would be obligated at this stage. Now, how could they be obligated in this stage if it hasn't seen the pnei habayit yet, or the pnei chatzer? hasn't gone into the courtyard or the chatzer. So Rav Papa is going to explain a bit of a strange case. Rav Papa is going to say, Amar Rav Papa Hacha, this derivation that the worker and the owner aren't obligated, but someone is, which would be the buyer, well, that must be a case of b'te'ena ha'omedet begina v'nofa notet l'chatzer askinan u'leman tamar labayit labayit. So now we're going to say the case is, you have a fig tree, or I have a fig tree. I'm the owner, I have a fig tree. My fig tree is standing in my gina, my garden, which is outside my courtyard, outside my house. And then though, but the branches jut into either my courtyard, which is a little more realistic, or even into my house. Okay? Right? They had open windows in those days. Maybe it went through the window into my house. So now when I pick those fruits and sell them to you, they've already come into the house. Now we're going to have to explain, we have to find a distinction between the owner, who actually, even though it's in the house, is not obligated, and the buyer, who will be obligated to tithe it. So now he's going to say the following. So again, either it's in the chatzer, if you're Rabbi Yochanan, who says the chatzer, or it's in the house, if you're Rabbi Yannai, who says the house. Ihachi, they say, wait, but I don't get it. If it's already in the house, then balabayit nami nichayev. Then the owner should also be obligated. Now, again, we need to find a case where the owner is not obligated and the buyer is. If it's already in the house and the branch went into the house or the branch went into the courtyard, the owner should also be. To which they say no. This case would be unique, and this is what Rav Papa is trying to explain, because balabayit einav b'te'enato v'lokeach einav b'mikcho. It's a very interesting theory. It's hard to exactly figure this out, but the balabayit is not really interested in the one fruit or two fruits that came in through the window into his house. Okay, the balabayit is interested in the entire tree because the tree produces fruits this year, next year, and lots of fruits, and therefore, if the tree juts into the house, you can actually pick one or two and eat them in your house. When will you be obligated? When you bring in all the fruits. That's when the obligation to tithe would come in this kind of weird case. Okay, when you would bring them, because first of all, it doesn't have this entryway into your house, and it's just kind of in your house already. And now, I saw the commentary said you would have to bring all of them into your house. I don't know if it means all or the majority. I don't know exactly how this would work, but that's when the balabayit, because the balabayit is interested in all the fruits. Now, if you bought 10 figs from me, so if they were picked in my house, for you, that's what you're interested in, those 10 fruits, those 10 figs. So therefore, for you, that would be gemar melakha, which is all interesting because it's talking about subjective gemar melakha, really. There is no objective definition, it's subjective. Again, this is Rav Papa's explanation. It's a bit out there, but that's how he explains that this doesn't necessarily contradict this source when it talks about, right, the kin nafshecha, that someone else would be obligated, in this unique kind of case, and it would have to have already gone into the house or the courtyard, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense with what we saw before, and that's the way we resolve this. But now the Gemara asks a whole difficulty on this drasha in the first place. The fact that they're darshaning, that the pasuk is teaching you that there's a case where the owner, and then obviously the worker, is not obligated to tithe, but a buyer would be, contradicts a concept that we're going to see in a minute, that a buyer actually is not obligated by Torah law. And if we're assuming this is a Torah drasha, we're darshaning it straight from the Torah, then it would be weird. How could the buyer be obligated? How could we be saying there's a case where the buyer is obligated and the others aren't, when a buyer isn't obligated at all in Maaser according to the Torah? So that's our next question. So we're now moving, I would say this whole section is in parentheses really, because we started with, I told you we're going to have 3 difficulties on Rabbi Yannai and Rabbi Yochanan. This was the first. Once we resolved it with this Rav Papa unique explanation, we're now going off on a tangent and saying something was problematic about this whole drasha in the first place. Lokach midoraita mi mechayev? Is the lokach even obligated in general to tithe? Let's say it all went into the house. Still, the buyer wouldn't be obligated. V'hatanya, it says in a braita, mipnei machar v'chanuyot shel Beit Hino, shalosh shanim kodem liYerushalayim. The stores in Beit Hino, which they say is Beit Hanina, which is a place even nowadays outside Jerusalem, right outside. Why were their stores destroyed 3 years before the destruction of Jerusalem? They obviously did something wrong that caused them to get punished early. What was it? They kept the strict Torah law and ignored the rabbinic ordinances and other rabbinic laws that were instituted. They said, we're going by the strict Torah, and as a result, they were punished. What, for example, did they do? And here comes our case. Shayu ombrim, turning now to Amabet, aser to aser va'achalta. Okay, let me read you the psukim. We're in Dvarim Yudalid, where it talks about taking maaserot, verses 22-23. So it says here, aser to aser et kol tvuat zarcha. You should take maaser, the tithes, on all of, notice, tvuat zarecha, your grain, hayotzeh sadeh shana shana, that comes out every year, va'achalta lefnei Hashem elokecha, and then you should eat it. So they're now going to darshan two things. The first one's not our issue. Aser to aser va'achalta. Because it says aser to aser, and then the next pasuk says, and then you'll eat. In other words, the order is, right, bring in your produce or do whatever, then tithe it, then eat it. It's talking about who's obligated to tithe, one who picks their own fruits in order to eat them. Not lo hamochir. If I sell you produce, I don't have to tithe it. Okay, the produce doesn't need tithing. Because, number one, I don't have to do it because it says only if I'm picking it to eat, then I have to tithe it if I'm eating it myself. And in the beginning of that pasuk it said, aser taser kol tfuat zarecha. All my produce, which means lo lokach. If I bought someone else's produce, according to the Torah, I don't have to maaser. So basically, we're limiting maaser, which is not true nowadays, because, in other words, again, not in their day either, because the rabbis extended it also to someone who sells the produce, also to someone who buys the produce. If the person didn't tithe it, then they would have to tithe it. But according to Torah law, the buyer doesn't even have an obligation. So this is what the people in Beit Hani or Beit Hanina would do. They would basically say, no maaser for someone who's selling it, not eating it themselves. No maaser for someone who buys it, which means that there's no Torah obligation. So how could you have a derive, right? How could you have this drasha on a pasuk, which comes to teach you that, again, the poel, the worker, is like the owner, that neither needs to tithe it when it's out there in the fields, or right when it hasn't come into Pnei Abayit, when they're out there in the fields, but a buyer would have to, in which case, if, again, it branched out into a chatzer or into a house, then the buyer would have to, but the other ones wouldn't. That pasuk can't possibly be telling you that if the pasuk doesn't even think a buyer ever has an obligation to tithe produce. To which the Gemara says, well, elami derabana, that whole drasha that we got to about the lokech, that's all on a rabbinic level. Yes, they darshaned it from a pasuk, but it's all on a rabbinic level, ukras machta ba'alma. And the pasuk, we've seen this many times, is just a mnemonic. We're using it as a mnemonic to remember. Kinafshecha, oh, the poel is like this. But this whole law is derabanan, and don't worry about that. So that question, side question, well, we dealt with it because we basically move this drasha into the realm of derabanan and not to oraita, and then we're okay. So then they say, okay, well then on a oraita level, and this is again, we're off our topic because our topic was first difficulty against Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yannai about when is it considered Gmar melakha, but it was all based on this drasha, and now we're going to say, well, since we moved that drasha into the rabbinic category, it's only a drasha from the rabbis, it's not about a Torah law. What's the real drasha on a Torah level from that pasuk? So what is that word coming to teach you? L'chidetanya for the following braita. Now we have a different drasha. Kinafshecha. Ma nafshecha, we're going to come back to this at the end of today's daf. Ma nafshecha im chasamta patul, af poel im chasamta patul. We're now going to compare the worker to the owner in a different way. If I muzzled myself. Now, why are they using the word muzzle? Because there's a pasuk that says, Lo tachsom shor b'disho. I'll give you some background before we explain this. Lo tachsom shor b'disho is a pasuk we're going to talk about soon, which is you cannot muzzle your animal while the animal is on the threshing floor. You have to let the animal eat. Okay, you can't muzzle them and not allow them to eat while they're working, which is very similar to our pasuk about a worker. A worker is allowed to eat on the job. The animal is allowed to eat on the job. But there's a big difference between the two psukim. By the animal, it says, lo tachsom shor b'disho, which means it's a lo taseh, which means it's a negative commandment. Negative commandment means if you transgress it, you get lashes. Our pasuk, our two psukim that we saw, is, I'll read them again, ki tavo b'kerem re'echa, when you go into your friend's vineyard, ve'achalta anavim kenafshecha sovecha, you can eat grapes to your heart's content, ve'al kalyecha lo titin, you just can't put them in your basket, but you can eat them. Now the worker, the owner, it never says, the owner can't stop you from eating. This just means the owner has to let you eat. But this is what we call a mitzvah asay. It's a positive commandment to let your worker eat. If you don't let your worker eat, okay, I'm not going to read the second pasuk, although we will read it later, which is if you come b'kamar re'acha. We'll get back to that pasuk later. But there's basically two pasukim that are all worded in the positive formulation. But there's no negative commandment. So if, let's say, you're working in my field and I don't allow you to eat, I won't get lashes for it because there's no negative commandment. And that's what they're saying here. Saying, don't think, and we'll see later why you might have thought to apply lo tachsom shor b'disho also by humans. But no, there is no negative commandment. So now how do they learn it? From a very interesting kind of creative way. Kin nafshecha, the worker is like you. Now what does that mean? I'm going back to the words I read before. Ma nafshecha im chasamta patur. If I'm working in my field and I decide while I'm working in my field I am not going to eat, right? The best I can think about is when you're cooking in the kitchen, right? And you don't taste the food, right? Sometimes we like to taste the food, or we nibble on things that we're cutting up as we're chopping them up. Not even we want to taste the finished product. We're just, cutting up vegetables and we start eating them. But if you want to, you can just say, listen, I'm not nibbling at all while I'm in the kitchen, right? I'm not going to eat anything in the field. Now, of course, you're patur. There's nothing wrong with doing that. You can say, okay, today from 9 to 5, I'm working in the field. I'm not going to eat anything that I'm picking. So you can do that, and obviously you wouldn't be obligated. So therefore, just like you're exempt, they say, nothing happens to you if you do that. Well, your worker is like you, that if you can say, well, I'm not going to eat, you can, and there's nothing wrong with that. So if you say to your worker, you can't eat, you're not going to be, now, it is forbidden. You can't do that because you're violating a mitzvah aseh, but there's no negative commandment, and because of that, you won't get punished. Okay, you get your patur, you're exempt from punishment. So that is the new drasha on kinafshecha, since the other one was only rabbinic. This is more Torah level obligation. Now we're going to move to the second difficulty against Rabbi Yannai and Rabbi Yochanan. Mativ marzutra. Ezehu gornan lemasrot. Okay, goren is a term that's used, and I'll show you where we get this from the pasuk when it comes to maaser. So here in Bamidbar, chapter 18, verse 27, it says, "V'nechshav lachem trumatchem." Okay, this is the pasuk. The context is maaser. And then it's calling them truma. Okay, they make this reference to the grains from the granary, and then the wine has its own term from the yekef. But basically, this term granary is also a term used for when you're obligated in maaser. So now they say, "Grono lemaaser lechayev alav mishum tevel, mishatigamer melachtan." So the goren for maaser, meaning when it's called goren, that it's in the granary, okay, that is going to obligate you mishum tevel. Tevel is the word we use to say items, food, produce that was not tithed yet. When is that? When does it be considered? Now, tevel is forbidden to eat, but again, you can eat it at an earlier stage. It's just once it becomes called tevel, then you can no longer eat it until you tithe it. Mishatigamer melachtan. Okay, so far that hasn't told us anything. When it's completely done. What is ezu gmar melachtan? But it continues, and it says, when is gmar melakha? Melechet hach... Oh, did I skip? I totally skipped one. I'm sorry. Mativ marzutra. I have to go back. I don't know why I just missed that. Okay, we're on the second one, and that's line... my Gemara, it's line 5. I apologize that I skipped. Gornan lema... Ezu mativ marzutra. Ezu gornan lema asrot. Okay, so again, this term goren, both talk about goren, and that's why when I look back, I looked by accident the wrong place. Gornan lema asrot. When... Again, produce, is it going to be considered goren, the granary? It's in the granary, which means it's obligated maaser. When is that? Bikishu'in or bidlu'im, we're now talking about things in the zucchini pumpkin family. Mishayipaksu. Mishayipaksu means, okay, we're going to see right now, Amar Rabbi Asi, Mishayinatel pikas shelahen. Okay, that didn't help us. The pikas, there's a debate, it didn't help the commentaries either. It's when, it's some stage, after you, okay, we'll see. It's some stage when the flowering part or maybe fibers that are on it fall off. It seems to be a stage once it's much more fully ripened. Okay, we'll see exactly when that comes about. But now they're going to assume, well, when would that happen? We don't know exactly when it happens. But we're going to assume right now, when would that happen? My labi shipaksu afilu basadeh, right? You pick all the zucchinis. So you pick them all, and then they're sitting in the field, and then the flowers or the fibers fall off. So now we're going to say, then at that point, what is gornan l'ma'aschot? When does it become obligated in tithing? Right then, even though they're in the field. And what did Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yannai say? When you brought them into the house. So how do we explain that? Well, lo, mishi paksu babayit. No, what we mean is, when you bring them in the house, and then they fall off. Okay, we're assuming, again, this is all just to explain our difficulty. We don't really know when it happens, but they're assuming you mean you bring it into the house, and then that flower or fibers fall off. So they say, ihachi, if that's the case, it should say, misha yipaksu. Why did it say misha yipaksu, from when it falls off? It should say, ad shi pasku mebaile. That when is gornam l'masrot? Until, right? It's you wait until, because you bring it into the house and it's still not enough. You still have to wait until it falls off. That would have been a much better way to say it. That would make more sense. To which they answer, no. Why did they have to say from when it falls off and not until when, which would mean, you have to come wait until that happens. Itana adshi pasku, until then, havamina adi gamar lepikusayu. You would have gotten confused and thought that what it means is until, if I bring in 100 zucchinis, it's until, if I say until it falls off, you would think it meant until all of the flowers or the fibers fall off of all the zucchinis. Kamashvalan, therefore, comes to teach you, mishi paksu michi atchule pikusayu. What it means is when the first one falls off. So I bring in 100 zucchinis, and on one of the zucchinis it falls off. That's already, because it's already in the house, and the first one fell off, it's already Gemar Melakha, and that's why it says from when it falls off, because from when it falls off makes it more sound like from when the first one. If you said until it falls off, you would think it meant until the last one falls off. And that's why they chose that wording. Okay, that was a side point. So again, second source, it seemed like, right? Our first source seemed like a buyer's obligated in Maser even when it's not even in the house yet. To which we had to explain it actually was in the house. And then we just had to explain why in that unique, weird case did the owner or the worker not have to take the Maser. Then we moved to Marzutra, who basically brings a different one, which also sounds like it's when the flower falls off, which we thought meant in the field, which again would go against Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yannai, to which we answered, no, we're talking about it when in the house, and then the first one, it fell off. That's a stage of, it's already enough ripened that fell off, and therefore that doesn't contradict Rabbi Yannai, Rabbi Yochanan. Third source, Mativ Marzutra. Also, Marzutra brought this third difficulty, right? For him, it was his second. Bered Rav Nachman, the son of Rav Nachman, and he says, I wonder if it's a different Marzutra. I didn't check that out, because in one place it just says Marzutra, the other one says Marzutra Bered Rav Nachman. I didn't check out if there were two people with the name Marzutra, but maybe someone can look that up if they're interested. Gorno lema'aser l'chayev alav mishum tevel mishatigamer melachtan. So this is what I was telling you before. When is it considered tevel that you have to take maser? You can't eat it until you do the maser. From when there's gemar melakha, okay, which is what we keep talking about. So far, we haven't said anything new. Ezehu gemar melachtan, but what is gemar melakha? Melechet hachnasatan. Now, the word hachnasa means a bunch of different things, and that's why we're going to have a difficulty, but then easily resolve it, because hachnasa could be gathering it, which usually would mean gathering it into a pile in the field, or it could mean bringing it in. Lahachnis is to bring in, and then it would be perfect. That's exactly what we're talking about, bringing it into the house or bringing it into the courtyard. But the first thing they think it means is, what's melechet hachnasatan? My lav hachnasatan afilu b'sadeh. Sounds like we're talking about making a pile. Right? They would make a pile, then they would flatten, that's called the kri, then they would do miruach hakri, they would flatten the top of the pile, and that's considered hachnasa. And then you're obligated maser at that stage already. So, the first answer, we're going to have two answers to this difficulty. Again, that contradicts the ones who say courtyard or house. Lo, hachnasatan l'bayit zeu gemar melachtan. You could say, bring it into the house, or alternatively the courtyard, whether you're Rabbi Yannai or Rabbi Yochanan, you would just say, no, it means bring it into the house or courtyard. And that's a very easy way to resolve it. But here's a second answer. Ibai deima, you could say, Ki ka'ama Rabbi Yannai, now we're going to start to distinguish between different types of produce. When Rabbi Yannai said, and presumably Rabbi Yochanan, you have to bring it into the courtyard or the house, what they meant was, b'zeitim va'anavim, they were talking about olives and grapes. Dilav b'nei goren yinhu, because they don't go into a granary and we don't do this pile and the whole thing. That happens only with the grains after you thresh and all that, and then you end up with a pile of the grains. And that's an action that doesn't exist by zeitim and anavim. Now, Tosafot has this whole thing, zeitim and anavim were usually meant, particularly when they talk about in the Torah for Maaser, we're talking about the wine and the oil. Here you're talking about eating the fruits themselves. That's a side point that we're not going to get into right now. But the point is that the zeitim and anavim, when you want to eat the grapes and the olives, you don't do goren with them. You don't put them in this pile. So for them, that's what Rabbi Yannai and Rabbi Yochanan were talking about. Their gemar melakha, now we're going to start to see, it depends on, again, this is one answer. We had a different answer, but that maybe even for theirs. But now we're going to say no. They were talking about grapes and olives. When you bring them into the house, that's gemar melakha for them because there is no goren. B'chitim v'sorim goren behedik tibe, and that's the pasuk I showed you. Shumatchem, right? It's kedagam mina goren. The dagan, the grains, have goren. Goren is in the granary. They would make this pile. They would flatten out the pile. That would be the stage for the grains. So then the whole sugya that they were talking about, the whole machloket between them, according to this answer, is only in olives and grapes as opposed to the grains. Grains have a different halacha, and there it wouldn't be bringing into the house. It would be, and let's say fruits and other things that are like fruits would be bringing it into the house. So we had this whole section. If we can summarize it very simply, we started with two opinions: bringing it into the house or bringing it into the courtyard. When you obligated maaser, we then had three difficulties against it, and each difficulty we resolved somehow. Either saying it was saying exactly what we said, or in the end, this last one, we had a possible two different types of produce that we're talking about. And the gemar melakha for each one would be something different. Just like we saw the kishuim had different. Now, different there, again, according to our interpretation, it was also in the house, it just also had to have this other stage of the flour or the fibers falling off. Okay, now we're going to move to our last sugya, which is, I mentioned that we were going to get back to this lo tachsom shor b'disho. Lo tachsom shor b'disho means while your animal is threshing, which is once the grain is detached from the ground, you bring it to the threshing floor and then they thresh, they trample on it in order to separate the wheat from the chaff. So that's talking about when the animals are working with produce that's already detached from the ground. You're not allowed to muzzle the animal. When it came to the humans and workers in your field, we said when they're in your field, okay, which we assume means when everything is still attached to the ground, you can't stop your worker from eating, or you have to let your worker eat, right? Remember, it's not in the negative, it's in the positive. But what the Gemara is going to say right now is the pasuk by humans, by the worker, talks specifically about when they're working in things that are attached to the ground. And how do we know that? Because it said kamat re'echa, the pasuk I didn't read you today, which is ki tavo b'kamat re'echa. It's the one right after the pasuk about the vineyard. When you go to where the grains are standing, which means they're attached to the ground still, again, you can take things by hand. You can't use a sickle or anything to cut stuff that you're planning to eat, but that's where it also proves it's obviously attached to the ground, but you can take by hand. Okay, now, I want you to notice already, because we're going to get back to this later, that pasuk starts with the word ki tavo b'kamat re'echa, when you come into your field of your friend when it's standing grains, and then it says chermesh lo tanif al kamat re'echa, which seems to be redundant. It's repeating kamat re'echa. Okay, now, thank you, Miriam, for pointing out that Mar Zutra and Mar Zutra Bered Rav Nachman are two different people. Okay, so thank you for pointing that out. Okay, now let's go back. So, eshkachan adam b'mechubar b'shor b'talush, adam b'talush minalan. So now we're going to see. Okay, the pasuk says a person when the crops are attached to the ground, and the shore. The issue is when it's detached from the ground. How do we know that a person is also allowed to eat when it's detached, which we saw in the Mishnah already, but the question is, where do we derive it from the Torah, since the Torah only talked about when it's attached to the ground, and then later we're going to get to, and how about a shore when it's attached to, when it's attached to the ground. Okay, each one that's missing, we're going to try to fill in, and we're going to have very parallel sugyas, which is, we're going to start in both cases, trying to prove through a kal v'chomer argument. We're going to reject the kal v'chomer argument. Then in both cases, we're going to try to reject the rejection of the kal v'chomer argument, but we're not going to succeed, which means we're going to be left with the rejection of the kal v'chomer. and then we're going to each have drashot from the pasuk, or maybe even the simple reading of a pasuk. So the first one starts out, Adam betalush. How do we know that a person, a worker, is also allowed to eat when it's detached from the ground, even though the pasuk was talking about when it's attached? Kavachomer mishor. Ma shor she'eino ochel b'mechubar, ochel betalush. Okay, you have to understand why shor is the kal one. Shor is kal because we're not commanded to stop the shore from, well, we can't stop the shore. We're not commanded to not stop the shore from eating, and we're not commanded that you can't muzzle the animal in a case of mechubar, when it's attached to the ground. So that makes it a leniency by shore. Now again, this whole kavachom argument, I will tell you from the beginning, you can obviously argue everything the reverse. Maybe it is strict because you can't muzzle them when it's talush, but right now you just have to go with it, okay? Like kavachom arguments sometimes are confusing. Anyway, we're going to reject it for some other reason. But a shore is kal because there's no prohibition to not to muzzle the animal. Sorry for all the double negatives. There's no prohibition to make sure, right, don't muzzle the animal when the animal is working with items that are attached to the ground. It doesn't say, there's nothing wrong with it, meaning it's not chamor, the chumr is not the shore, the chumr is the person who hires the animal. Okay, so there's no prohibition against muzzling in mechubar, and yet ochel b'talush, but you can't muzzle them when it's detached. So adam she'ochel b'mechubar, in an adam where the din is more chamor, more stringent, because you have to let them eat when they're working when it's attached to the ground. Eino din she'ochel b'talush. Wouldn't it be obvious then that you would, by kavachomer argument, that you would have to allow them to eat when they're working when it's detached from the ground? To which the Gemara says, you wanted to say the shore is kal and the lenient one, and the adam is the stricter one. But ma l'shor sheken atam mitzuvel chasimato. Tomar ba'adam she'yatam mitzuvel chasimato. The shore is obviously more strict because there's a negative commandment. This goes back to what we said before. There's no negative commandment by your worker. It just says let them eat, but it never says you're not allowed to muzzle them, stop them from eating. Whereas by shore it says you're not allowed to muzzle your animal. So clearly shore is more strict, in which case you can't make a kavachomer argument, okay? And then you won't be able to learn. So now the Gemara, as I said, is going to try to reject this rejection. Okay, so we had a kavachomer, we rejected it, we thought the shore was kal because there's no prohibition in chubar, in attached, but because there is a negative commandment where there is an issue, and therefore it's more strict than humans, and therefore than workers, and therefore you can't make a kavachomer argument. But now the Gemara says, maybe Adam is, and this we know it's not true because we already said it's not true, but right now they're suggesting, maybe you say there is a negative commandment by your worker, and maybe we'll learn it from a kavachomer from the shore. And here goes. Ma shore. Now, how is shore? There is a way that shore is more lenient. This is from the parsha we just read yesterday. Ma shore she'i atam mitzuvel lachayoto, atam mitzuvel chasimato, adam she'atam mitzuvel lachayoto, eino din she'atam mitzuvel chasimato. Now they're making a comparison between two halachot. In our parsha yesterday that we read, it says v'chei achicha imach, your brother should dwell with you. We had the whole thing with Ben Petur and Rabbi Akiva, the big famous machloket about the canteen, the one canteen, and who gets to drink it. But the real simple reading of chei achicha imach means you have to help support poor people in your community. You have to help them stay alive. So now they say, well, there's no commandment to help a shore stay alive, right? You don't, first of all, we are allowed to slaughter them, right? There's no commandment to help support your shore and let them eat. And yet, when you're working with your shore in the fields, there's a negative prohibition against preventing them from eating, which seems connected. If you have to let your shore eat on the job, and yet you're not commanded lahachayoto to support your shore, so wouldn't you say then, Adam, that you're commanded to support, all the more so you're commanded to let them eat? In which case, maybe you would say that just like by shore there's a negative commandment, we can learn a negative commandment to your worker from a kavachomer. If chei achicha imach is true by humans, then of course lo tachsom shor b'disho would be applicable for your worker as well. And therefore, maybe you'd say there is a negative commandment derived by a kavachomer, in which case you can't reject the kavachomer that we just did a minute ago. To which they say, which we already know, no, because amar krak kin nafshecha. As we learned earlier on this daf, kin nafsho shepoel right? Kinafshecha kinafsho shel poel, right? Your soul is like the soul of your worker. Ma nafsho im chasamto patur, just like you're exempt. There's no negative commandment to prevent yourself from eating while you're working. A poel im chasamto patur. If you happen to not allow them to eat, you would be exempt from punishment. There's no negative commandment, which means there is no negative commandment, which brings us back to our question, Ela Adam betalush minala. So basically, we're back to, this was trying to reject the rejection of the Chava Chomer, so we're left back with, since we didn't succeed in rejecting the rejection, because there is no lo taseh by humans, which means shore is definitely stricter, which means that you can't have a Chava Chomer and put the shore in the kal part and the human in the stricter part. So that doesn't work. So let's try, and we're now going to have two other ones. One is a drasha from a pasuk, and one is what we call the simple reading of the pasuk. So number 2, Amar Kra, Kama Shte Pamim. I told you this to notice before. Ki tavo b'kamat re'echa, and at the end it says Chamesh lo tanif b'kamat re'echa. So why does Kama appear twice? Imenu inyan la'adam b'mechubar, t'neu inyan la'adam b'talush. This is a classic, bit of a strange type of method of darshaning the Torah, but it's a legitimate method, which is, if we already know it, and it already said it once, and it says it twice, it must be coming to teach something else. So if it can't be teaching you about what we know already, which is don't eat in the standing grains, right? Standing grains is when it's attached. It must mean don't eat when it's detached, even though that's not what it says, but the unnecessary one is coming to teach you something else, and that's how we get it. Rabbi Amiyom Amal. Adam b'talush lo tzarech kra. You don't even need a pasuk, because the first pasuk says, Ki ktiv, ki tavo b'kamat re'echa, when you go into your friend's vineyard. What do you go into your friend's vineyard to do? All sorts of things. You could be going, milo akin shescharola katef, and you're not only going liftzol, which is to harvest the field, but you could be going in to carry katef on your shoulder. You could be going in to take all the grapes that have been picked already. There's all sorts of reasons why they would hire someone to go into their vineyard, and the Torah doesn't specify which one. It just says when you go into the vineyard for any kind of work. So therefore, the Torah says you can eat. So therefore, the simple reading of the pasuk includes talush also. And that's how we get it, either from kama or the emeno inyan, or we get it from this. So now we get to shor b'mechubar minalan. And since we got the first one, we're now going to get the second one more easily, because it's basically the undoing of that and like different, the kind of the mirror image of the sugya. Kava chomer me'adam. So now they're going to do the exact reverse. They're going to say, let's do a kava chomer from human, from the worker. Ma adam she'eno ochel b'talush ochel b'mechubar. So again, why is the adam kal? Because there is no commandment to prevent him, again, in the end we darshaned it, but there's no commandment in the Torah to say when they're working with things attached to the ground, you have to let them eat. You don't. It's sorry, I said it wrong. Adam eno ochel b'talush, right? There's no obligation to allow, there's no obligation for the employer to allow the worker to eat when it's detached. And yet, ochel b'mechubar, yet the owner is commanded when it is attached. So therefore, shor she'ochel b'talush, a shor that it already says you can't stop, you can't muzzle the animal when it's detached, so that would mean it's more strict. Ein odin she'ochel b'mechubar. Shouldn't it then be obvious that also you can't muzzle it when it's mechubar from the adam, who can't be can't be stopped, prevented from eating when it's attached. So, again, they're going to reject it. Mala adam shekenatam mitzuva lachayoto. The reason we saw before. What's the chomer by a person? Because we're commanded to support people, humans. We have to help poor people. Tomar b'shor, but you could say by shor, it's a more lenient halacha because there is no such thing. She'yatam mitzuva lachayoto. To which the Gemara suggests, like I said, something pretty preposterous, because how could we possibly, they're going to say, Yehi shor mitzuva lachayoto mikav chomer. Maybe we are commanded to support the shor. Okay, which is crazy because we can also kill shvarim when it comes to slaughtering them, right, if we want to eat. But maybe there's a commandment to keep shvarim alive and help them by feeding them. And how would you learn it? From a kavachomer. And here it comes. It's the mirror image, kind of the other way of looking at it. Well, sure, we have a lo taseh, negative commandment, don't muzzle it. So all the more so, right, if by humans we don't have that lo taseh, and yet by humans we're commanded to keep them alive, then all the more so. Wouldn't you think the shore that we have a negative commandment, don't muzzle? Wouldn't you think then? Wouldn't you think that you have to keep them alive and give them food? To which they say no. That's not a way. We don't say that because the pasuk says your brother should live among you. Your brother and not an ox. Okay, and therefore hachayoto is only for that. And therefore, again, we reject the kavachomer because Adam is more chamor because we have this v'chei achicha imach, which doesn't apply to a shore, even though we tried to say maybe it does, we didn't succeed. So now, like the other one, we're going to again learn it from a pasuk. Ela shor b'mechubar minalan amar kra, and it's really the same exact rasha, because in the beginning of that pasuk it said kamat re'echa, and then it said kamat re'echa, and we said it says it twice, kama. Now we're going to focus on the re'echa, okay, the second part of that phrase. Amar kra re'echa shtei pa'amim, which is your friend. Imeno yan la'adam b'mechubar, t'nei yan l'shor b'mechubar, right? Re'ech obviously means fellow human, but since the second time it says it is totally unnecessary, maybe it's also talking about a shore. So since the pasuk is talking about when it's attached, and it's talking about a human, and then it mentions a second time a person, it must be, we mean shore, okay? Because again, what's the purpose of having it if not that? We'll leave the next answer. The next answer is actually goes to both of them. It's going to be a fourth answer for the first, for the human, and the worker, and a third answer for the shore, which is Ravina says, Lo adam b'talush v'lo shor b'mechubar tzrichei krai. Again, he's going to say like the last answer we have by the adam. You don't even need a pasuk, and we're going to see where we get it from. He's going to say Lo dichtiv lo tichsom shor b'disho, and it's going to continue into tomorrow, how he learns it and thinks it's obvious. You don't even need a pasuk for it. So the two things we did today, we dealt with Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yannai, and their machloket, and three difficulties against both of them, right? Both of them as one unit, even though they disagree, but all three sources seems to go against both of them. And then we tried to figure out the case that wasn't mentioned by each one, the adam b'talush, from detached, that you can't stop your worker from eating things while they're working in detached produce, and that you can't stop your shore from eating when it's in attached produce. Where do we learn that from? Try each one by kal v'chomer. In the end, we said either drasha from a pasuk, or it doesn't even need a pasuk because it's obvious from the simple reading of the text. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a lav, Shavua Tov, and Shnishma B'Silchot Tovot.